The town of Blackfin Cove had always been small, the kind of place where the salt air clung to your skin, and the ocean was a second home. A strip of pastel-colored beach houses lined the shore, their windows turned toward the Atlantic like eager spectators. The economy thrived on summer tourism, families from upstate piling in for 4th of July fireworks, honeymooners chasing the romance of sunset cruises, surfers carving the glassy waves at dawn. But Blackfin Cove had a secret, one it had buried for years. The first body washed up on a Sunday morning. Hal Pritchard was the one who found it. He was walking his dog, a thick-necked pit bull named Diesel, when he saw the thing tangled in the rocks. At first, he thought it was just a pile of seaweed, maybe some driftwood from the last storm. Then Diesel started growling, hackles raised. Hal stepped closer. It was a man, or what was left of one. The body had been torn in half, the lower torso missing. His rib cage had been cracked open, and what remained of his flesh looked like it had been gnawed. Hal had spent 20 years as a fisherman, seen plenty of dead things dredged up from the deep. But this was different. The cops arrived within the hour. Sheriff Roy Halstead stood over the remains, his jaw locked tight. Beside him, Dr. Elaine Mercer, the town's medical examiner, crouched down, brushing aside the wet sand clinging to the corpse. "These aren't boat injuries," she murmured, her gloved fingers tracing the jagged wound along the exposed ribs. "These are bite marks." Roy's stomach turned. "Shark?" Elaine hesitated. "Maybe. But this isn't normal feeding behavior. Sharks don't eat this much of a person. They usually bite once and move on." Roy exhaled, glancing out toward the water. Tourists were already setting up umbrellas, kids running into the surf. If there was something out there, something big. "We keep this quiet," he said. Elaine shot him a look. "Quiet? Roy, this was a person. If there's an animal out there that did this..." "I know. But if we start yelling shark, we'll have the whole damn town in a panic. We investigate first." Elaine frowned, but she didn't argue. That afternoon, Roy called in Jake Fowler, a grizzled marine biologist who had lived in Blackfin Cove longer than anyone. Jake was an old salt, skin like sun-baked leather, eyes sharp as a gull's. He arrived at the morgue, taking one long look at the remains before letting out a slow whistle. "This wasn't no great white," he said, voice rough as sandpaper. Roy crossed his arms. "Then what did this?" Jake scratched his scruffy chin. "Hard to say, but I'll tell you one thing. It ain't local." "What do you mean?" Jake looked up, his expression grim. "Most sharks don't hunt this close to shore, not like this. And these wounds? Looks like something took its time." He glanced toward Elaine. "How fresh is he?" "Best guess. He died sometime late last night." Jake nodded. "That means whatever did this is still out there, and if it's feeding this close to land, it ain't gonna stop." The second attack came 2 nights later. A group of teenagers had been out night swimming, drinking cheap beer, laughing, pushing each other into the waves. It wasn't until one of the girls started screaming that anyone noticed Bryce McCready was gone. The search party found his body floating at the edge of the jetty, the moonlight glinting off his torn flesh. His leg had been bitten clean off, the stump ragged and leaking dark tendrils into the tide. This time, the news couldn't be buried. By morning, the town was in an uproar. The mayor, Richard Calloway, tried to downplay the situation. "A freak accident," he called it. "Nothing to be alarmed about." But the locals weren't buying it, especially when old Jake started talking. "I seen something out there," he told a growing crowd outside the docks. Bigger than any shark I ever laid eyes on." He spat into the sand. "We keep these beaches open, we're gonna have more bodies washing up." Roy knew the town was at a breaking point. They needed answers. They needed proof. So, against every rational thought, he went out on the water. The boat rocked gently beneath them, the night air thick with brine. Roy stood at the bow, shotgun in hand, while Jake manned the spotlight. They'd been out for hours, trailing bait lines, waiting for something, anything, to break the surface. Then the ocean changed. A ripple, so subtle it was almost imperceptible. Then another. The water darkened, a shadow moving beneath them. Roy's breath caught. Jesus Christ! A dorsal fin broke the surface, but it wasn't like any shark's fin he'd ever seen. It was serrated, jagged, ridged like the spine of some prehistoric beast. The creature moved beneath the boat, its sheer size sending waves slapping against the hull. Then it rose. A mouth emerged from the black water, rows upon rows of teeth, needles sharp and unending. The head was massive, gnarled, with eyes that glowed an unnatural shade of yellow. It wasn't just a shark. It was something older, something that had been lurking in the deep for centuries. Jake moved fast, grabbing the harpoon gun. He fired, the spear sinking deep into the beast's side. It let out a sound, a guttural, wet roar, before diving. The rope attached to the harpoon went taut, nearly yanking Jake overboard. Then, with terrifying speed, the creature surged up. The boat tilted violently as a massive, scaly body slammed into the side. Roy fired. The shotgun blast ripped into its flesh, but it wasn't enough. Jake was already reloading when the thing struck again. This time, it hit the stern, the force sending him sprawling. The harpoon gun slid across the deck. Roy lunged for it. Too late. A maw of teeth closed around Jake's torso, lifting him into the air. His scream was cut short as the jaws crushed inward, splitting him in two like a rag doll. Roy didn't think. He grabbed a flare gun, aimed for the open mouth, and fired. The flare exploded inside the creature's throat. It thrashed, its body convulsing, before disappearing beneath the waves. The ocean went still. By morning, the town was silent. No one dared go near the water. The beaches were empty, the docks abandoned. The thing was still out there, wounded, angry, waiting. Roy knew it wasn't over. And the sea was still hungry.